Masechet Horayot, Daf Tet, and on this daf we will complete the second perek. The Mishnah teaches, "En chayavin al shemiat kol ve'al bitui sefatayim ve'al tumat migdash ve'kadashav." A court that gives an erroneous ruling about one of the following three things does not bring their pad ha'elem davar shel sibur. They do not bring any korban. And the three things are, if one swears falsely about testimony. They say, do you have testimony about this? Have you heard anything about this? He says, no, I don't know anything about it. That swears falsely. Normally an individual who has such a false swear will have to bring a korban olev yored. And also, bitui sefatayim, a false utterance of some other matter. That's also korban olev yored. And if someone brings tum'ah into the mikdash, or one of sacrificial food makes it tameh, also one has to bring a korban olev yored. We already know this principle, so this is really just fleshing out what we know from the previous Mishnah, that the Bet Din, the judges, do not bring any korban regarding something that if an individual did it, he'd have to bring a korban olev yored. If the court makes a mistaken ruling about that, the court does not bring a pad. Court only brings a pad about something for which the individual would bring a regular fixed korban hatat. Now, it's worth looking inside the Pesukim all about these three categories and the korban olev yored, because we're going to be referencing these Pesukim a few times. This is all in chapter 5 in Vayikra. V'nefesh ki techeta v'shame'ah kol Allah. That's why shame'ah kol. A person heard a public imprecation. V'hu ayed v'or ra'ah o yada im lo yagid v'nasa avono. He heard, does anybody have testimony about this? And he has testimony. And he says, no, I don't know anything. That's case one. Or someone who becomes tameh in any of these ways, and he forgot about it. Or he touched a person, and he's tameh, and he's guilty. He's not guilty just for becoming tameh. It's okay to become tameh. It's a mitzvah to go and bury someone, and so on. But the problem is if you're tameh, and then you come into the mikdash. Okay, you did it unwittingly. No, that's why you bring a korban hatat for that. Or a person that utters an oath to bad or to good, tishabat lebate bisfatayim lehada or lehetib, and he is guilty. In these three cases, remember these words, le'achat me'eleh, of one of these sins, and he realizes his sin, and he did it by mistake, but then he realizes, and he confesses. What does he bring? This is now the laws of korban olev yored. He can bring this, a sheep, female from the flock, sheep or goat. Now that's ideally what he should bring. But if he cannot afford it, he can't afford a sheep, then he could bring 2 birds. That's enough. And he brings them, and the Kohen will use them. And if not, the next paragraph says, he's so poor, he cannot even afford 2 birds. In that case, he brings asiri ta'ifa sodat lechatat, 1/10 of an ephah of flour. That's pretty cheap. And so even a poor person should be able to offer that. He doesn't have to put oil on it. And it's a sin offering, so you don't make it fancy like you would for a different kind of offering, but very simple. And he brings it. The Kohen will take a kometz, and the last pasuk, remember this word also, me'achat, from one of these. In other words, one of these options: an animal, a bird, or flour. V'nislach lo. Okay, so we have me'achat here. We had above le'achat to refer to one of the 3 sins. Okay, those will be important words. So now, back to the Mishnah. A Bet Din is not liable to bring any korban for these 3 sins, because for these 3 sins, an individual will bring a korban olev yored, and the Bet Din does not bring a korban chatat, par helim davar shel sibur, if the individual would have to bring a korban oleh v'yored in such a case. We learned in the previous Mishnah that this also applies to the Kohen Gadol. Same law, does not bring his pod for his mistaken ruling that he himself follows, unless it's for something that other people would be chayav chatat kebu'ah, so then he does not bring a pod if it's an oleh v'yored type of sin like these three. V'hanasi kayoseh bahem dibre Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili. Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili says that a king also does not bring a korban oleh v'yored. Even if he violates one of these three sins, by mistake he does not bring this korban. The Gemara will explain why. Rabbi Akiva Omer, hanasi chayav bechulan chutz mishemiat kol, shamelech lo dan v'lo dainin oto, lo me'id v'lo me'idin oto. Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili and says that a king would bring a korban oleh v'yored for swearing falsely or for bringing tuman to the mikdash, but the only one he's exempt from that he would agree that the king does not bring is if he swears about knowing testimony, swears falsely. He actually does know testimony and he swears that he doesn't. Why not? Because there's another rule that we learned back in Maseches Sanhedrin, that a king cannot be a judge, nor is he judged. He does not swear as a witness, testify, nor do other people testify against him. Since he doesn't testify, therefore, the whole law does not apply to him. He can't be a witness, and therefore he's not going to be liable if he swears falsely that he doesn't know any testimony. Amar Ula, Ma'ita Amad Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili. Ula asks, what's the source for Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili to say that a king never brings a korban oleh v'yored? Amar Kera ve'hayachi esham le'achat me'ele. So he learns it from these words, le'achat me'ele, if someone is guilty regarding one of these three matters. Kol shemitchayev b'achat mitchayev b'chulan, ve'shen mitchayev b'achat en mitchayev b'chulan. From this phrase, one of these, we learn that someone who could be liable in all of them will be liable in whatever one he did, but someone who cannot be liable in any one of them is not going to be liable in any of them. In other words, since a king does not testify, Rabbi Akiva said that, Rabbi Yoseh HaGalili agrees with that, since a king does not testify, he cannot bring a korban oleh v'yored for swearing about testimony. Since he cannot bring a korban regarding one of them, he does not bring a korban regarding any of them. That's what we learn from le'achat me'ele, one of these, that the one is connected to all the rest of them, and since he's not liable to one, he's not liable to any. We ask, this phrase, one of them, you can interpret in the exact opposite way to say, anyone who is liable in any one of them will have to bring that korban, even though he cannot be liable in all of them. That one of them does not apply, still the other two will apply. So this phrase is ambiguous, and therefore this is not a good source. Rather, a second derivation, Detanya. Haya Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer, Ne'emar lo tagiya yado, Ne'emar lo tasig yado. Mi sheba lidei aniyut v'ashirut yasa nasi Mashiach she'en ba'in lidei aniyut. Regarding the korban oleh v'yored, it says, bring an animal. If he cannot afford that, then a bird. If he cannot afford that, lo tasig yado, then bring flour. Therefore, this type of korban applies only to a person who could be poor and could be rich. That's regular people. Sometimes you make money, sometimes you lose money. You could be rich or poor. But that does not apply to a king. A king, by definition, is rich. He could, if he's out of money, he can raise taxes. He can take anything he wants. He owns everything in the country. And therefore, a king cannot be poor. So since he would never be in that category of you're too poor to afford an animal, therefore, the entire category of this type of korban does not apply to him. And that same is true for a Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol cannot become poor, as we are about to prove. Nasi dichtiv asa achat mikol misvot Adonai Elohav mi she'asa al gabav ela Hashem Elohav. Regarding a Nasi, in the previous chapter in Vayikra, regarding a Nasi who does a regular sin, it says if he does one of the misvot of Hashem, his God. What do you mean his God? Just say Hashem Elokim, as it usually says. Oh, we learned that a king, there is nobody above him except for Hashem, because he's the highest authority, highest human authority in the world of the country. And so that's why it says Elohav, that it's his God. He has a personal connection in the sense that there's nobody in between. There's no authority above him. And so we see from here that a king is always going to be on top of everybody else. So he's not going to be poor. He can raise taxes on anybody he wants. Mashiach tichtib. והכהן הגדול מאחיו, שהוא גדול מאחיו בנוי, בכוח, בחוכמה ובעושר. The Kohen Gadol is called the Kohen who is greater than his brethren. Greater in what way? We learn he has to be greater in his beauty, greater in his strength, greater in wisdom, and greater in money. He has to be wealthier. He has to be wealthier than all the other Kohanim. Therefore, he's wealthy. האחרים אומרים, מניין שאם אין לו גדלו משל אחיו, מאחיו, תלמוד לומר, והכהן הגדול מאחיו, אשר יוסק על ראשו, גדלהו מאחיו. Others say, it's not really arguing, what we just said before is that you're going to choose someone who is wealthy, and the others add that, what if he doesn't have? And maybe he was Kohen Gadol, and now he lost his money, or he's appointed, but he's poor, so then what do? You will raise him up from his brethren. In other words, we're going to make a collection. All the Kohanim will have to chip in enough that the Kohen Gadol will be restored to his wealth or get wealth, and he'll be richer than everybody else. And we know that from the pasuk that says, HaKohen Gadol me'echav, we're reading me'echav, from his brethren. And Kohen will become richer from taking money from his brethren. So Gadelehu raise him up from the money of his brethren. And so therefore, the Kohen Gadol and the king can never become poor. Since they can never become poor, the whole category of Korban Oleh v'Yored does not apply to them. That's the reasoning of Rabbi Yosef Galili. One last question about this. Nasi shenistara mahu. Question asked by Ravina from Rav Nachman by Yitzchak. A king who gets sara'at, he cannot serve as king. Temporarily, until he gets better, he cannot serve as king. Now, what about that king? Mahu, mitcha dache, o mipatar patir. Amar le dilach o de gaza. So the question is, let's say king, he got sarat. Now, he's demoted. He's not going to serve as king at this point. What if he does one of these sins and, swears falsely or whatever? And then, does he have to bring a Korban Oleh v'Yored during that time when he's not acting as king? Do we say generally, when he is king, why do you say that he doesn't bring Korban Oleh v'Yored? Is he totally eliminated from the whole category and doesn't apply to him at all? And therefore, even though he's not acting as king now, still, he will not have to bring it? Or do we say, he's just patur, that when he's king and he does one of these three sins, really, he is obligated to bring a Korban Oleh v'Yored, but because of a technicality, he doesn't bring it. But really, he would be liable. And therefore, now that he is not effectively king, so that liability will actualize. Because the thing that loophole, that technicality that was getting him out of the obligation no longer exists. So then, in that case, he would have to bring a Korban Oleh v'Yored during that time when he became a Mesorah. That's the question. And the answer of Nachman's answer is, when he brings a Korban, does he bring it from your money? No, he brings it from his treasury. And therefore, since he's bringing it from his own treasury, he's still rich. Even though, so for a few days, he's Sarat, but he still has all his money. And therefore, the reasoning that we just said here still applies to him, that he cannot become poor. Even for those few days, he's not going to be poor. And therefore, he does not bring a Korban Oleh v'Yored, even during the time that he has Sara'at. Tanya. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Mashiach patur mikulan. Rabbi Akiva says that a Kohen Gadol does not bring any Korban Oleh v'Yored. Amar Rava, my tamad Rabbi Akiva. Rava asks, what is Rabbi Akiva's reasoning for a Kohen Gadol? Rabbi Akiva cannot use the reasoning that we just said, that a Kohen Gadol is richer than everybody, is rich, and therefore doesn't have to bring it, because Rabbi Akiva obviously does not agree with that logic, because if you accept that logic, then that would apply to a king also, that a king is rich, and therefore would not bring Korban Oleh v'Yored. But Rabbi Akiva thinks that a king does bring a korban olev yored for 2 out of the 3 sins, just not for the one about testimony, but a king does. And therefore that shows that according to Rabbi Akiva, a rich person can bring a korban olev yored. So he'll always bring the animal. So what? But just because he's not poor, why can't he bring the rich man's type of korban olev yored? And therefore that reasoning cannot, since it doesn't apply to a king, does not apply to a Kohen Gadol either. So now we're asking, according to Rabbi Akiva, why do you say a Kohen Gadol does not bring a korban olev yored? Amar Rava, my tamad Rabbi Akiva amar kira, ze korban Aharon ubanav, zo ba'a chova lo, ve'nacheret ba'a chova lo. He learns it from the korban mincha that a Kohen Gadol brings. He has to, while he's Kohen Gadol, he has to bring asiri ta'ifa in the morning and in the afternoon. So that's what he brings every day, a korban mincha, meal offering in the morning and the afternoon. So since it says zeh, this is the meal offering that Aaron will bring, it means that this is the only meal offering that the Kohen Gadol has to bring and no other. Since he's excluded from the entire category of bringing a korban mincha, a meal offering, as a korban olev yored, therefore he's going to be excluded from the whole category of korban olev yored. Since he will never be obligated to bring another meal offering, and meal offering is one of the kinds, one of the subgroups of korban olev yored, therefore he does not bring any korban olev yored. That's Rabbi Akiva's source. We ask about that. Okay, just because the pasuk said zeh, that the Kohen Gadol only brings this type of korban mincha that he brings every day of the year. So just because the Torah excluded him from the poor man's type of korban olev yoreh, which is an asir ta'ifa, but the other one, that's the middle poor for birds, or the rich person who brings animals, the Torah never said that a Kohen Gadol doesn't bring those, so why not say that he can bring those two? It was proof we don't understand it. Oh, we will learn it from the phrase me'achat that we saw all the way at the end of the Pesukim. If you remember the Pesukim right here, the last one said me'achat me'ele, one of these 3 types of korbanot that of korban olev yored, the bird, the animal, or the meal offering. And we learn from me'achat me'ele that the one has to be like the all, hamitkaper be'achat mitkaper bechulan, ve'shem mitkaper be'achat and mitkaper bechulan. Someone who could possibly bring every one type can use any of the types, but someone who is excluded from any one of them fundamentally cannot bring any of them, and therefore, since the Kohen Gadol cannot possibly bring a meal offering, he does not, from this pasuk zeh, therefore he does not bring any of them. So that's Rabbi Akiva's full reasoning. But now we come back to why don't you apply that same reasoning to the pasuk that we said before? Ela me'ata dichtiv ve'haya ki yasham le'achat me'ele hachi nameh dechol mitchayev b'achat mitchayev bekulan ve'yeshem mitchayev b'achat en mitchayev bekulan. Allah matenan Rabbi Akiva omer nasi chayav chutz mishmi'at kol. If you're going to read pasuk 13 that says me'achat in that way, then also read pasuk 5 that talks about the 3 types of sins and said if someone is liable to any one of these, why not then read, Rabbi Akiva should read it the same way and say anyone who could possibly become liable for every one of these will be liable to whichever one he does, and anyone who cannot become liable to any one of them will not become liable to any of them. And Rabbi Akiva, however, does not say that, because in the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva said that a king is liable in 2 out of the 3, just not regarding testimony. So we can't, Rabbi Akiva does not use the same logic for le'achat me'ele, and you just said he does use that midrashic methodology when it comes to me'achat me'ele. So what's the difference? We have an answer. Abaye v'Rava d'amre tarvayhu me'achat mashma le le'achat la mashma le. Oh, the words here me'achat that were over here, that he does derive them methodologically from one of the sins, but not le'achat to one of the sins. We ask further, umay shana me'achat mashma le. And why? So what me'achat? It still means either way of one of the sins. So what's the difference? And the answer is it's not actually the mem and the lamed, but rather the placement. The pasuk that says for any one of these types of sacrifices is said all the way at the end in the very last pasuk regarding the meal offering. It's there specifically to say that someone who could possibly be liable to bring a meal offering will be liable to bring the bird or the animal depending on their level of wealth. Because if you thought that there should be a general rule that anyone that someone has to be able to bring any one of them in order to be liable to bring any one of them, then it should write me'achat me'ele regarding the middle level of poverty regarding birds, or put it at the beginning regarding the animals. Why does the pasuk wait all the way till the end to put that word? To teach me that it's specifically someone who cannot bring the meal offering, then will not bring a bird or an animal. But that's not true in general, that you would say for any case that if you can't bring one, then the others don't apply. And so that this methodology we're applying only here regarding if you can't bring the meal offering, you don't bring any of the other types of korban, the birds or the animals. So that's why we're applying it here. However, in the other pasuk that says, of these sins, there we do not apply this methodology, because in general, Rabbi Akiva is not applying the methodology all over the place. It's only about the placement over here regarding meal offering. That's why he applies the methodology here. But regarding the three types of sins, there he does not say that. There he says, even though a nasi, one of them doesn't apply to him, doesn't matter. The other two will still apply to a king. Last Mishnah of the Perek, Kol ha-misvot shebat Torah, shechayavin al zidonan karet v'al shigatan chatat, hayachid mebi kisba us'ira, regarding any laws in the Torah, for which if you did it on purpose, you would get karet. If you do it by mistake, you have to bring a korban chatat. What type of korban chatat will you bring? Depends on who you are. A regular individual will bring either a kispa or a se'ira, a female sheep or goat. Hanasi sa'ir. A king will bring a sa'ir, male. Mashiach ubet din mevi'in par. Both the Kohen Gadol and the judges who issue a false ruling, they bring a par. Uba avodah zarah. If any of these people have a sin that relates to idolatry, hayachid v'nasi v'mashiach mevi'in se'ira. All the single people, the regular individual and the king and the Kohen Gadol, they bring a female se'ira, a goat. Ubet din par v'sa'ir. Bet din, who issues a mistaken ruling about idolatry, will have to bring both a par and a sa'ir. Par le'olah v'sa'ir lechatat. That's category one. Now, asham talui, a asham that's provisional. Someone ate cheleb, someone ate some meat, and I'm not sure. It might have been cheleb, it might have been kosher, I don't know. There's no way for me to tell right now. So in the meantime, you're bringing asham talui that will suspend the guilt until such time. If you ever find out, then you'll bring a korban chatat. If in fact it was cheleb, who brings an asham talui? Hayachid v'nasir chayavin. Mashiach ubet din peturin. Only an individual and the king, they have to bring it. But the Kohen Gadol and the bet din never bring an asham talui. Asham vadai. Hayachid v'nasir v'mashiach chayavin ubet din peturin. Asham vadai, that's for certain sins like me'ilah and certain types of stealing. An individual brings it, and a king brings it, and the Kohen Gadol also brings it, but a bet din does not bring an asham vadai. Al shemiat hakol, val bitus sefatayim v'al b'tumat mikdash v'kadashav betin peturin. Regarding these three sins, that for which one would have to bring a korban oleh v'yored, the judges do not bring such a korban for these three sins. V'hayachid v'hanasi v'mashiach chayavin. However, an individual and a king and the Kohen Gadol, they are liable to bring a korban oleh v'yored. So notice that it says here that a king would bring in such a case. This was following the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Definitely not Rabbi Yosei Galili. He said that a king does not bring it at all. Rabbi Akiva said 2 out of 3. But anyway, this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. That Rabbi Shimon will end up agreeing with Rabbi Akiva, even though he doesn't say so here, that the king does bring it for 2 out of the 3. And here, the Kohen Gadol also brings it, according to Rabbi Shimon. Ela she'en Kohen Gadol Mashiach chayav al tumat mikdash v'kadashav deber Rabbi Shimon. However, the Kohen Gadol only will not bring a korban oleh v'yored for bringing tum'ah into the mikdash or with sacrificial food. That's according to Rabbi Shimon. So there is a case according to which Rabbi Shimon says a Kohen Gadol brings a korban oleh v'yored. U'mahen mevi'in. Anyone who has to bring a korban oleh v'yored, what would they bring? Anyone who does any of these sins, who is liable, what would they bring? Korban oleh v'yored, sliding scale, depending on how rich or poor they are. Rabbi Elazar omer hanasi mebi sa'ir. Rabbi Elazar said, if a nasi does, and those 2 out of the 3 that he is liable for, he will bring a sa'ir and not any of the others certainly not a bird or a meal offering because he's rich, but in addition he brings a sa'ir. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon hayano ten kelal. Now the Gemara cites a baraita that elaborates on the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Kol she'achid b'asham talui hanasi kayoseh bo u'mashiach betin peturin. Any matter for which an individual have to bring an asham talui, like he ate some fat but he's not sure what it is, so a king also will be liable in those same cases and have to bring the same thing. However, a Kohen Gadol and a Bet Din do not bring an Asham Talui ever. V'chol shu be'asham vadai, nasu Mashiach v'kayoseh bahen, Bet Din peturin. And anything that requires an Asham vadai, like Me'ilah, a king and a Kohen Gadol also would have to do the same thing as an individual. However, judges do not bring an Asham Vadai either. Shimiat Kol, Ubitu Sivatayim, V'tumat Mikdash, V'kadashav. And now for the category of Korban Oleh Ve'yored, for these 3 sins of denying testimony, swearing falsely, or bringing Tumah to the Mikdash, or regarding sacrificial food, Bet Din never brings a korban oleh v'yored. Nasi u'mashiach chayavin, ela shen nasi chayav b'shmiat hakol, v'lo mashiach betumat mikdash v'kadashav. The king and the Kohen Gadol will bring korban oleh v'yored in some cases. But there are exceptions in that a king is not liable regarding testimony. He doesn't bring testimony, but he is liable in the other 2. And the Kohen Gadol is not liable when it comes to bringing Tumah into the Mikdash and Kadashav. We'll see the reasons for this soon, but it would be liable for the other 2. Kol shu be'olev yored, nasi kayoseh bo, u'mashiach ben ubetin peturin. For anyone who has to bring a korban oleh v'yored, the king will have to bring the same thing according to his wealth, and the king is wealthy, so fine. A king will always bring the wealthy type of animal, but a Kohen Gadol and the judges are piturin. Now we have a contradiction here, because here he says that the Kohen Gadol is patur from any korban olev yored, but a line above he says that a Kohen Gadol is exempt because of tumah, but for the other 2 types of sin, he would be liable to korban olev yored. So Gemara asks about that next. Hagufa kashya. There's a contradiction within this baraita. Amarta she'en Mashiach chaya betumat mikdash v'kadashav, betumat mikdash v'kadashav hu depatur, ava b'shmat kol ubitui sefatayim chayav. In the middle of the baraita here, you said that a Kohen Gadol is not liable when it comes to bringing tumah to the mikdash or its holy things. So that means he is not liable regarding that category, but for the other 2 categories of false testimony and swearing falsely, denying testimony, or swearing falsely, the Kohen Gadol would be liable. But then, at the end, Emasefa, Kol Shu Be'olev Yored, Nasi Kayoseh Bo, Mashiach Betin Peturin, Katani Mashiach Betin Peturin, Ma Betin Peturin Mekulehon, Af Mashiach Patur Mekulehon, Kashya Hadadeh. Then at the end of the Baraita says, anyone who brings a Korban Olev Yored, will, whatever he has to bring, whatever he have to bring, and the king is within that category. He has to bring in accordance with his wealth. But the Kohen Gadol and the Bet Din are not liable. So now it says here that a Kohen Gadol and a Bet Din are not liable, and we can compare them. Just like the Bet Din is not liable at all. The Bet Din does not bring any type of Korban Olev Yored. So too, the Kohen Gadol, according to this line, does not bring anything. So now we have a contradiction. Amar Ravuna bered Rav Yoshua la kashya. Kan bedalut, kan bedale dalut. No, the difference is what type he brings. When it says that he doesn't bring anything at all, that just means that he doesn't bring the poorest. A Kohen Gadol cannot bring a meal offering. But when it says he is liable in 2 out of the 3 categories, he will have to bring a bird and or an animal depending on his wealth. And so the middle was saying he has to bring a middle one, a bird, if he cannot afford an animal. But the last line in the Braita, when it says, no, he doesn't bring anything at all, that means he doesn't bring a meal offering ever. Rabbi Shimon sabar la Rabbi Akiva bechada, ufaleg ale bechada, sabar la Rabbi Akiva bedele dalut, defatur. And Rabbi Shimon, this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the student of Rabbi Akiva, even though he's a student, he can agree with him on one thing, and he disagrees on another matter. He agrees with Rabbi Akiva regarding the poorest, the meal offering, that a Kohen Gadol does not bring the poorest. Rabbi Akiva said, since he can't bring the meal offering, he doesn't bring any of them. That was Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, no, he can't bring the meal offering, but regarding the bird offering, he could bring that, and he certainly could bring an animal if he was wealthy enough. The Mishnah taught that according to Rabbi Shimon, a Kohen Gadol is not liable for any korban if he brings tumah to the mikdash or to sacrifices, but he will be liable for a korban olev yored for the other 2 cases of sins. Amar Chizkiya, my tamad Rabbi Shimon. Chizkiya asks, what's the source of Rabbi Shimon? Dichtib, v'nichreta hanefesh hahi mitoch hakahal, mi shekorbano shaveh lakahal, yasa zeh she'en korbano shaveh lakahal. Because it says in a pasuk in Bemidbar that someone who is not pure will get karet because if he comes to the mikdash, because he brought defiling tumah to the mikdash. And so he says nichreta hanefesh mitoch hakahal. So it's comparing this the person to the whole kahal. Therefore, someone whose korban is equal to that of the rest of the congregation will get karet if he does it on purpose and have to bring a korban olev yored if he does it by mistake. But that comes to exclude someone whose korban is not the same as everybody else's. And a Kohen Gadol's korban is different. It's different on Yom Kippur when the Kohen Gadol brings a par for himself, but a sa'ir for the rest of Bnei Israel. And so since he's not mitoch kahal, he's not the same as the congregation. So regarding this specific sin of bringing tumah to the mikdash, he is excluded. If so, a king also doesn't bring the same type of korban hatat as the rest of the kahal. He brings a different he-goat, they bring a she-goat. So isn't that different? No. Shaveh bechapara de Yom Kippurim. And Nasi and the kahal are the same when it comes to Yom Kippur, that the Kohen Gadol's se'irim, the 2 se'irim, that covers all the regular people and the king also. So since they're the equivalent for that, the Nasi is included in having to bring a korban olev yored for tum'ah in the mikdash. Okay, how about regular Kohanim, not the Kohen Gadol? They are not equal to the rest of the congregation regarding Kapara on Yom Kippur, because the par that the Kohen Gadol brings covers himself and also all the Kohanim. And therefore, according to that, you would come to the conclusion that Kohanim would not be liable to Korban Olev Yored for Tumat Mikdash, but that's not true. We answer, Kohanim shavu lakahal b'shar mitzvot shana kula. Kohanim are the same as everybody else regarding all other mitzvot. Any korban chatat, if someone does just a regular korban chatat sin, Kohanim bring the same type of animal as everybody else. We ask, Mashiach nameh hashaveh b'shar mitzvot shana. A Kohen Gadol is the same as everybody else when it comes to regular sins. If the Bet Din makes a mistake, that is, and the Bet Din and people follow it, and the Bet Din brings a par, so there the Kohen Gadol is equal to the rest of the people, and that they will be exempt because of the pod of the Bet Din. Ela marava ema hachi mi shechatato shava lichidim umaynihu kahal. Rava says no. Explain this way: someone whose sin offering is the same for individuals. In other words, for the individual that does a sin, there the Kohen Gadol has a different type of individual sin offering, a pod, compared to everybody else. And so, who are those Yechidim? That is the Kahal. And therefore you see that because the Kohen Gadol specifically is different from everybody else, he cannot be part of this Kahal, where it says that someone who comes into the Mikdash is going to get karet with the kahal. Oh, that means only someone whose korbanot are in some way similar to the kahal. But the Kohen Gadol sacrifices are not similar to the kahal, and therefore the Kohen Gadol will not have to bring a korban olev yored for bringing tumah into the mikdash. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hanasi Mebi Sa'ir. The end of the Mishnah teaches that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a king who violates one of the mitzvot for which a regular person would have to bring a korban olev yored, the Nasi instead brings a Sa'ir, which is the normal korban that a Nasi would bring for a regular sin or a regular korban chatat. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo amar Rabbi Eliezer ela betumat mikdash v'kadashav, ho'il v'ne'emar karet bo kebikvu'ar. Rabbi Yochanan explains that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the king only brings a sa'ir for one of the three types of sin, which is bringing tumah into the mikdash or to sacrifices. Why? Because regarding bringing tumah into the mikdash, it says karet, and also a regular korban chatat also is karet if you do it on purpose. So since both of these are karet if you do it on purpose, therefore it makes sense that Nasi would have to bring his regular chatat kibu'ah, which is a sa'ir. However, for the other sins that are related to korban olev yored, the Nasi would have to bring the regular korban olev yored. He's rich, so he'll have to bring the animals. Amar Papa, Hachina me mistabera. Disal kadatech Rabbi Eliezer al kulehon ka'amar, mikedi sa'ir Nasi, upar Mashiach bimkom yachid, lechatat ka'eh. Nitne name Mashiach mebi par b'shemi'at kol u'bitui sefatayim. Ela midela katani Mashiach shema'amina atumat mikdash v'kadashav ka'eh, de Mashiach patur. Rapapa says, I am in agreement with Rabbi Yochanan, and it makes sense, because if you would think that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's referring to all the three types of korban olev yored sins, that the king would have to bring a sa'ir and not the regular korban olev yored. Well, let's see. Sa'ir is what the Nasi brings for a regular sin, and a pad is what the Kohen Gadol would bring for a regular sin. So therefore, by the same logic, if you're going to extend that the same logic, that special people who have a special korban chatat kivu'ah would bring that instead of a korban olev yored, well then, just like Rabbi Eliezer applied that to the king, he should apply that also to the Kohen Gadol, and say that the Kohen Gadol brings a pad for the other two that he has to bring a korban something for instead of an olev yored. If he denies that he has testimony or he swears falsely, then he should bring a pad. We're not including the tumah in the mikdash because we established already that the Kohen Gadol does not bring anything for bringing tumah into the mikdash. But for the other two, he is liable, so then let him be liable also for those two. In other words, if you would say that the king has to bring his regular chatat kivu'ah for all three, then the Kohen Gadol would have to bring his regular chatat kivu'ah for the two that he is liable for. But we don't say that. Ela midela ketani Mashiach, since Rabbi Eliezer doesn't talk about Kohen Gadol at all, it must be that the Kohen Gadol brings the regular korban olev yored, could be a bird, and so too the king would only bring that sa'ir for Tumat Mikdash V'Kadashav, but the rest of them the king would bring the regular Korban Olev Yored, and the Kohen Gadol, he's patur in Tumat Mikdash V'Kadashav, so he wouldn't bring anything at all. So Rav Papa is bringing a good proof for Rabbi Yochanan. However, Amar le Rav Huna bered Rav Natan Rav Papa, Mimai. Rav Huna son of Rav Natan says to Rav Papa, how do you know this? Dilma Rabbi Eliezer akulohon ka'eh. Maybe in fact Rabbi Eliezer, when he says a king brings a sa'ir for these types of sins, he's referring to all three types of usually olev yored sins. A king would bring a sa'ir for all three of them. Ube Mashiach sabar lak Rabbi Akiva damar Mashiach patur bekulan. And so you say, if you ask, how come he doesn't say anything about Kohen Gadol? Well, maybe he agrees with Rabbi Akiva, who says that a Kohen Gadol doesn't bring any korban or anything for the korban olev yored sins. All three sins, a Kohen Gadol doesn't bring anything for, so it's totally not relevant. So your proof is not a proof. And he answered him, wait, even Rabbi Akiva, who said that a Kohen Gadol does not bring a korban olev yored, doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't bring anything. Maybe he doesn't bring the birds and the animals and the flour. He doesn't bring the korban olev yored thing. But if he does at least two of those three sins, maybe he would bring a par. And so, just even if he agrees with Rabbi Akiva, still your point is invalid, because it could be that he would still bring a par, and so he would have to say that. But Rabbi Eliezer doesn't say that. Therefore, since Rabbi Eliezer does not apply his rule to Kohen Gadol at all, it makes sense he does not apply his rule to a king regarding the other two, but rather only the one that has karet. For the one that has karet, bringing Tumah to the Mikdash, for that one, the king brings his regular sa'ir. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Modeh Rabbi Eliezer she'en mebi asham. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Eliezer would agree that in the case of defiling the Bet HaMikdash, although if the king knows that he did this, he did it by mistake, but he realized and he knows that he did bring Tumah into the Mikdash, he would have to bring a sa'ir instead of korban olev yored. But what if he's not sure? There's 50-50 chance. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. He does not bring an asham talui. Although a king could bring an asham talui for other regular sins, for which one would bring a chatat, a fixed chatat, and he's not sure, he'd bring a korban olev yored, a korban asham talui. So for a regular korban, instead of regular korban chatat, if he was not sure, he'd bring a korban, an asham talui. But for this one, although he's bringing a sa'ir, which is his normal chatat kebu'ah, but if he's not sure regarding bringing Tuman to the Mikdash, he would not bring an Asham Talui. Taneh Tana Kamed Rav Sheshat. Asham Talui Ba'al Tumat Mikdash Ve'Kadashav. A Tana recited the following Baraita in front of Rav Sheshat, and he said, Asham Talui is the proper Korban for someone who is not sure if they entered the Mikdash or made the sacrifices Tameh. He's not sure, someone who's not sure they did that will bring an Asham Talui. Rav Sheshat heard that and he said, Amar le, damar lach maneh. Who told you that? And he said, oh, Rabbi Eliezer, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says, Damar ho'il v'ne'emar bo karet kebekebu'ah, ma'iteh nasi sa'ir aleha. Because Rabbi Eliezer said, since it says karet regarding bringing Tumah into the Mikdash, just like sins for which one brings a chatat kibu'ah are also require karet if you do them on purpose. And because of that, Rabbi Eliezer said that a nasi brings a sa'ir. In other words, according to Rabbi Eliezer, now Rabbi Eliezer said this precisely for this one law regarding a king, since he brings a special korban, a sa'ir, for regular sins that would be karet if you did it on purpose, and there are chatat if you bring it by mistake. So too, Rabbi Eliezer says, oh, you know what? Let's add also this one, bringing Tumah into the Mikdash, because that's also karet if you did it on purpose. So the king will bring his regular korban. So in that sense, Rabbi Eliezer said that the korban for bringing Tumah into the Mikdash is similar to a fixed Korban Chatat. Now, it's true to be Eliezer said that regarding a king, but now this Baraita that this Tana quoted is assuming that that would be true for other people as well, other people who would bring a korban olev yored for bringing tumah into the mikdash. If they are not sure if they did that, they also would bring an asham talui. That's what that baraita was saying. But this is not true. V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan modeh Rabbi Eliezer she'en mebi asham talui. Rabbi Yochanan says Rabbi Eliezer agrees that one does not bring an asham talui. That's what he said right over here. Over here he just said asham, but you can tell he means asham talui because in the last requote of it says asham talui. So even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that the king does not bring an asham talui if he's not sure. So you see, we're not treating it exactly the same as a regular korban chatat, not for a king, and therefore not for anybody else either. One brings an asham talui for a sin which, if you knew you did it for sure, then you'd bring a regular korban chatat. But you do not bring an asham talui for something that if you knew you did it on purpose, you'd bring a korban olev yored kashya. And indeed, this is a challenge against of this contradiction between the statement of Rabbi Yochanan and this baraita. Hadran alech hora Kohen Mashiach chazakim uberuchim.